The rain over Boston's North End fell in sheets so thick that the black umbrellas outside St. Anthony's Church looked like a single undulating wound against the gray sky. Mourners pressed together under the stone archway, their breaths misting in the cold April air, their faces carved into masks of appropriate sorrow. Inside the church, the scent of lilies and old incense clung to every pew, every hymnal, every trembling hand that reached for a tissue. The casket at the altar was closed, mahogany, polished to a mirror shine, draped in white roses and a single ribbon of black silk. The man inside it had been dead for 6 days. His name was Lorenzo Enzo Marchetti, and he had been the beloved younger brother of Domenico Marchetti, the head of the most powerful Mafia family on the eastern seaboard. And in the very last pew, half hidden by a marble pillar, sat a woman no one wanted there. Her name was Dr. Ilara Vance. She was 34 years old, a board-certified grief counselor with a PhD from Columbia and 10 years of experience in trauma recovery, complicated mourning, and family systems therapy. She had published papers in peer-reviewed journals. She had testified before state committees on the psychological impact of violent loss. She had held the hands of widows, orphans, and shattered parents, while they screamed into the void. She was, by every objective measure, exactly the kind of professional a family in crisis should want at their side. But Ilara Vance was also fat. Not Hollywood curvy, not pleasantly plump, not the kind of softness that gets photographed in lifestyle magazines with words like brave and unapologetic printed underneath. She was genuinely, unapologetically, undeniably fat, a woman whose body took up space in a world that punished women for taking up space. Her hips spread wide on the wooden pew, her belly pressed softly against the waistband of her black wool dress. Her upper arms filled the sleeves of her blazer. Her face was round and kind, with deep brown eyes that missed nothing, and a mouth that defaulted to a gentle, listening curve. She wore her hair in a simple low bun, and her only jewelry was a pair of small pearl studs her mother had given her before she died. She had been hired 3 days ago by the Marchetti family's attorney, a nervous man named Mr. Gallo, who had called her office at 11 o'clock at night and said, "Dr. Vance, I've read your work on complicated grief in families with high conflict dynamics. We need you. The family needs you. Please." She had said yes because the desperation in his voice was real, and because she had never been able to turn away from real desperation. But, from the moment she had arrived at the Marchetti compound, a sprawling waterfront estate in Winthrop that looked more like a fortress than a home, she had been treated like an embarrassing mistake. The widow, a brittle woman named Celia Marchetti, had looked her up and down with the kind of dismissive flicker that thin women had been giving Ilara since middle school. "You're the grief counselor?" Celia had said, her voice dripping with incredulity. "You look more like someone who should be grieving a lost cake." The other relatives had laughed, not loudly, not openly. They were too well trained for that, but a ripple of smirks had passed through the room like a cold draft. Ilara had stood there, her leather satchel clutched in both hands, and let the humiliation wash over her without flinching. She had been fat her entire life. She had been mocked, dismissed, underestimated, and erased by people like Celia Marchetti her entire life. She knew how to stand still while the wave broke over her. She knew how to breathe through it. She knew how to wait. "I'm here to help your family process this loss," Ilara had said, her voice calm and steady. "Grief is complicated, especially in families with complex dynamics. I'd like to meet with each of you individually, if you're willing." "We don't need therapy," Celia had snapped. "We need justice. My husband's brother was murdered. Do you understand that? Murdered. Shot in the chest outside a restaurant in the North End like a dog. We don't need someone to hold our hands and ask us how we feel. We need someone to find who did this and make them pay. That's Domenico's job, another voice had said, low and rough, from the doorway. Your job is to keep this family from falling apart while I do it. Elara had turned and seen Domenico Marchetti for the first time. He was not what she expected. She had braced herself for the stereotype. The brute in a too-tight suit, the thick neck and cold eyes, the man who wore his violence like cologne. But Domenico Marchetti was something else entirely. He was tall and lean, with the kind of controlled stillness that came from decades of knowing that any sudden movement could be fatal. His hair was black, threaded with silver at the temples, and his eyes were a pale, piercing gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit with no tie, the top button of his shirt undone, and his hands were the hands of a man who had done terrible things. Scarred knuckles, a missing fingernail on his left ring finger, a thin white line that ran from his wrist to his palm. He was 52 years old, and he looked like a Renaissance painting of a grieving saint who had personally sent half the people he was grieving to meet God. He had looked at Elara with those pale gray eyes, and for a long moment no one spoke. "You're the counselor," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Elara said. "Dr. Elara Vance. Gallo says you're the best. I'm very good at what I do." "And what is it you do?" "Exactly." Elara had met his gaze without flinching. "I help people grieve honestly. Most people don't. They perform grief. They use it as a weapon, or a shield, or a currency. They lie with their tears. I help them stop lying." Something had flickered in Domenico's eyes, something sharp and quick, like a blade catching light. He had studied her for another long moment, his gaze moving over her face, her body, her hands, her posture. She had felt the weight of that gaze like a physical pressure, but she did not look away. "Fine," he had said at last. "Do what you need to do, but stay out of my way." And then he had walked out of the room, and Celia had given Elara a look of pure venom, and the other relatives had dispersed like smoke, and Elara had been left standing alone in the marble foyer of a house full of people who did not want her there. That had been 3 days ago. Now she sat in the back of St. Anthony's Church, watching the funeral of a man she had never met, and listening. Listening was the core of her work, not the passive hearing that most people did, where they waited for their turn to talk. Real listening, deep listening, the kind of listening that picked up on micro-tremors in the voice, on the pauses between words, on the places where breath caught or didn't catch. Elara had spent 15 years training her ear to detect the difference between authentic emotion and performed emotion. She could hear when someone was crying real tears versus forcing themselves to cry. She could hear when a memory was genuinely felt versus rehearsed. She could hear when grief was being used as a mask for something else. Guilt, rage, relief, greed. And right now, sitting in that pew with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the casket, she was hearing something very wrong. The eulogy was being delivered by a man named Vincent Abruzzo. He was, according to the program, a close family friend and business associate of the Marchetti family. He was in his late 50s, with a full head of silver hair and the kind of tan that came from winter vacations in places where extradition treaties were weak. He wore an expensive black suit and a tie with a subtle pattern of crossed keys, the symbol of the Abruzzo family's shipping empire. He stood at the podium with the easy confidence of a man who had given many speeches to many powerful people, and his voice was warm and rich and perfectly modulated. "Enzo Marchetti was more than a friend to me," Vincent Abruzzo was saying, his hands resting lightly on the edges of the podium. "He was a brother, not by blood, but by choice, by loyalty, by the sacred bond of our shared vision for the future of our families. Elara's ears pricked up. Shared vision. That was interesting phrasing. She had spent the past 3 days interviewing family members, and not one of them had mentioned any shared vision between Enzo and Vincent Abruzzo. In fact, Enzo's teenage daughter, a fierce, grieving 17-year-old named Sofia, had told her something very different. "My dad hated Vincent Abruzzo," Sofia had said, her voice flat and hard, her dark eyes dry despite the tears that had been flowing non-stop from every other relative. "He said Vincent was a snake. He said Vincent wanted to merge the families, and my dad thought it was a terrible idea. He said it would destroy everything my grandfather built." Elara had filed that information away carefully. Now she listened as Vincent Abruzzo continued his eulogy, his voice dipping into a practiced, trembling register. "In the weeks before his death," Vincent said, "Enzo and I spoke many times about the future, about the alliance that would make both our families stronger, about the legacy we would leave for our children. He told me, and I will never forget these words. He told me, 'Vincent, the only way forward is together. The old ways are dying. We must unite, or we will fall separately.'" There it was. Elara felt the words hit her, like a cold finger pressed against the back of her neck. She sat up straighter, her heart beginning to beat faster. She had heard that phrase before. Not those exact words, but that rhythm, that cadence, that particular construction of language. It was rehearsed. It was scripted. It was not the way people spoke when they were remembering something a dead loved one had actually said. When people quoted the dead authentically, their language was messy. It was fragmented. It was full of pauses and corrections and little verbal stumbles as they tried to reconstruct a memory in real time. They said things like, "He always used to say," well, not always, but that one time. He said something like, they didn't deliver perfectly polished sentences with parallel structure and rhetorical balance. They didn't sound like they were reading from a teleprompter. Vincent Abruzzo sounded like he was reading from a teleprompter. And more than that, the content of the quote didn't match what Elara had learned about Enzo Marchetti. She had spent hours with his daughter, listening to stories about him. She had read his journals, which Sofia had secretly given her. She had interviewed his housekeeper, his driver, his personal chef. Every single person had described a man who was deeply traditional, fiercely protective of his family's independence, and openly suspicious of the Abruzzo family's growing power. The idea that Enzo Marchetti would suddenly decide that the old ways are dying and push for a merger was not just unlikely, it was fundamentally incompatible with everything Elara had learned about him. She sat very still in her pew, her mind racing, as Vincent Abruzzo finished his eulogy, to a smattering of respectful applause. The funeral continued. Prayers, hymns, the solemn procession of pallbearers, carrying the casket down the aisle. Elara watched the faces of the mourners as they passed. She saw genuine grief on some. The housekeeper, the driver, a young man she recognized as Enzo's personal assistant. She saw performative grief on others. Celia Marchetti, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. A cluster of business associates whose expressions shifted the moment they thought no one was watching. And she saw something else on the face of Domenico Marchetti, who walked behind the casket with his jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. Domenico was not performing. Domenico was barely holding himself together. His grief was a living thing, a wild animal barely contained behind the bars of his self-control. His pale gray eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, and his hands were shaking, actually shaking, as he walked. Elara had seen that kind of grief before. It was the grief of a man who had lost the one person in the world who made him feel human. She made a decision. sitting there in that pew, as the organ music swelled and the mourners filed out into the rain. She was going to find out who had killed Enzo Marchetti, not with guns or threats or mafia tactics, with the only weapons she had, her ears, her training, and her absolute refusal to be dismissed. The memorial dinner was held that evening at the Marchetti estate. The great hall had been transformed into a somber banquet space, with long tables draped in black linen, candles flickering in crystal holders, and photographs of Enzo arranged on easels around the room. The photographs showed a man with a warm, crooked smile and kind eyes, a man who looked nothing like the cold, calculating mafia stereotype. In one photo, he was laughing with his daughter on a sailboat. In another, he was cooking pasta in a flour-dusted apron. In another, he was standing beside Domenico, both of them young and handsome, and full of the invincible arrogance of men who had not yet learned how much they had to lose. Elara arrived at the dinner in the same black dress she had worn to the funeral, because she had not packed for an extended stay, and the Marchetti family had not offered to provide her with anything. She was not invited to sit at the family table. She was not invited to sit at any table, actually. She found a place along the wall, near a potted palm, and stood with a glass of water in her hand, watching. Sophia found her there. The 17-year-old appeared at Elara's elbow like a ghost, her dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, her black dress hanging loosely on a frame that had clearly lost weight in the past week. Sophia Marchetti had her father's eyes, warm and dark and full of intelligence, and her uncle's jaw, sharp and stubborn. She was, Elara had learned over the past 3 days, the only person in the family who was not performing. "You heard it too, didn't you?" Sophia said quietly, not looking at Elara. Her eyes were fixed on Vincent Abruzzo, who was holding court at the center of the room, surrounded by a cluster of nodding, sympathetic faces. "The thing he said, about my dad wanting the alliance. I heard it," Elara said. "It's a lie. I know." Sophia turned to look at her then, and Elara saw something flicker in the girl's dark eyes, something that looked almost like hope. "You believe me?" "I believe what I heard," Elara said. "And what I heard was a rehearsed speech, not a genuine memory. Your father never said those words. Someone wrote them for Vincent Abruzzo, and he practiced them until they sounded natural. But they don't sound natural to me." Sophia's breath caught. "Can you prove it?" "Maybe," Elara said. "But I need your help. I need to know everything you know about your father's relationship with Vincent Abruzzo. Everything he told you. Everything you overheard. Everything you found in his papers." Sophia was silent for a long moment. Around them, the dinner continued. The clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of forced laughter. No one was looking at the fat grief counselor and the dead man's daughter, standing together in the shadows. "My dad kept a safe," Sophia said finally, "in his study, behind the painting of our grandfather. I know the combination. I opened it the night he died, before anyone else could get to it." "What was inside?" "Letters, contracts, a recording." Sophia's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "A recording of Vincent Abruzzo threatening my dad, telling him that if he didn't agree to the merger, he would regret it, telling him that accidents happen to people who stand in the way of progress." Elara felt her blood run cold. "Do you still have it?" "I made copies," Sophia said. "The originals are hidden. The copies are in my room. I was going to give them to my uncle, but—" She hesitated. "But Uncle Domenico is so broken right now. I don't think he can see clearly. I think if I gave him the recording, he would go after Vincent immediately. And Vincent has too many men, too many allies. It would be a bloodbath." "So you've been waiting," Elara said. "I've been waiting for someone who would believe me." Sophia looked at her with those dark, desperate eyes. Someone who isn't part of this world. Someone who can see things the rest of them can't. Alara reached out and took the girl's hand. Sophia flinched, then relaxed, her fingers curling around Alara's like a child, reaching for a lifeline. "I believe you," Alara said, "and I'm going to help you. But we have to be smart about this. We can't just accuse Vincent Abruzzo in front of everyone. He's too powerful, and he's too well protected. We need to expose him in a way that leaves him no room to maneuver." "How?" Alara looked across the room at Vincent Abruzzo, who was now raising a glass in a toast to Enzo's memory. His voice was warm and sad, and perfectly, nauseatingly sincere. "We're going to use his own lie against him," Alara said. "We're going to make him repeat it." The plan came together over the next 2 hours. Alara and Sophia retreated to a quiet corner of the estate, a small library that had belonged to Enzo, and spread out the evidence Sophia had gathered. The recording was damning. Vincent Abruzzo's voice, cold and sharp, threatening Enzo if he didn't agree to the merger. The letters were even worse. Detailed plans for a hostile takeover of Marchetti shipping routes, with Enzo's refusal noted as the primary obstacle. And the contracts showed that Vincent had already begun moving assets into position, preparing for a merger that Enzo had never agreed to. "He killed my dad," Sophia said, her voice breaking for the first time. "He killed him because my dad wouldn't say yes." "I think so," Alara said gently. "But we need to prove it in a way that everyone can see. Not just your uncle. Everyone. The whole family. The whole organization. If we can expose Vincent publicly, his allies will abandon him. No one wants to be associated with a man who murders his business partners over a refused merger. How do we do that?" Alara thought for a moment, her mind working through the psychology of the situation. Vincent Abruzzo was a performer. He had rehearsed his eulogy. He had practiced his grief. He had crafted a narrative that served his interests. Performers, in Alara's experience, had a weakness. They couldn't improvise under pressure. If you forced them off script, they fell apart. "We're going to ask everyone at the dinner to share a memory of your father," Alara said. "A specific memory, something personal, and we're going to pay very close attention to who can do it authentically and who can't." Sophia frowned. But Vincent already gave his eulogy. He already shared his memory. "He shared a rehearsed speech," Alara said. "He didn't share a memory. There's a difference. And I think if we put him on the spot, if we ask him to repeat that phrase he used, that only way forward is together line, he won't be able to do it naturally. He'll have to think about it. He'll have to remember how he phrased it. And that hesitation will be visible to everyone. Will that be enough?" "It will be a start," Alara said. "And then we'll play the recording." Sophia's eyes widened. "In front of everyone?" "In front of everyone. Your father deserves justice, Sophia. Not revenge. Justice. And justice requires the truth to be seen." They spent the next hour preparing. Sophia went to her uncle and asked him, quietly, privately, to gather everyone in the great hall for a final toast to Enzo's memory. Domenico, hollow-eyed and exhausted, agreed without question. He trusted his niece. She was the only family he had left that he could bear to look at. Alara, meanwhile, positioned herself near the front of the room, close enough to see faces clearly, but far enough to remain unobtrusive. She had asked Sophia to make sure the recording was ready to play through the house's sound system, a system that Enzo himself had installed for family gatherings, with speakers in every room. Sophia had nodded, her jaw set with determination. The guests filed back into the great hall, confused but compliant. Mafia families were used to following orders, even when they didn't understand them. Vincent Abruzzo looked slightly annoyed at the interruption to his networking, but he smoothed his expression into one of patient sorrow as he took his place near the front of the room. Domenico stood at the head of the table, a glass of wine in his hand. He looked terrible, his skin gray, his eyes sunken, his voice rough when he spoke. "Thank you for staying," he said. "My niece asked me to gather you all for one more remembrance of my brother. She said it would help her, help all of us, to hear more about who Enzo was. Not just the businessman, not just the brother, the man." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. People shifted in their seats, preparing to perform. "I'd like to start," Sophia said, stepping forward before anyone else could volunteer. Her voice was steady, but Ilara could see her hands trembling at her sides. "My father was the kind of man who remembered everything, not just birthdays and anniversaries. He remembered the little things. The name of my third-grade teacher, the flavor of ice cream I liked when I was 7, the song that was playing on the radio the first time he taught me to drive. He remembered because he paid attention, because he cared." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, the room was silent. Real silence. The kind of silence that comes when people are actually listening. "Thank you, Sophia," Domenico said, his own voice thick. "Would anyone else like to share?" A few people spoke. The housekeeper, tearfully, about how Enzo always made sure she had fresh flowers in her room. The driver, gruffly, about how Enzo had paid for his son's medical bills without ever being asked. The personal assistant, haltingly, about how Enzo had taught him to tie a tie on his first day of work. Each memory was messy, fragmented, full of pauses and corrections, and little verbal stumbles. Each memory was real. And then Vincent Abruzzo raised his glass. "If I may," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "I'd like to add something to what I said at the funeral. Enzo was a visionary. He understood that the world was changing, and that our families needed to change with it. He told me, many times, that the only way forward was together, that the old ways were dying, that we must unite, or we would fall separately." Ilara stepped forward. "Excuse me, Mr. Abruzzo," she said, her voice calm and clear. Every head in the room turned toward her. She felt the weight of their gazes, the dismissive flickers, the raised eyebrows, the barely concealed smirks. She had been looked at like this her entire life. She knew how to stand still while the wave broke over her. "Yes?" Vincent said, his tone polite, but his eyes cold. "The grief counselor, isn't it? I'm not sure this is really your area of expertise." "Actually," Ilara said, "it is. My area of expertise is listening, and I've been listening very carefully tonight. I've noticed something interesting. Everyone who has shared a memory of Enzo tonight has done so in their own words. Messy words. Imperfect words. The way people actually speak when they're remembering something real." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "But you, Mr. Abruzzo, have used the exact same phrase twice now. The only way forward is together. The old ways are dying. We must unite, or we will fall separately." Those exact words, the same rhythm, the same cadence, the same perfect, polished sentence structure. Vincent's smile tightened. "I have a good memory." "Do you?" Ilara said. "Then you won't mind if I ask you to repeat it again. Right now, without thinking about it. Just say the phrase, naturally, the way you remember Enzo saying it to you." Vincent opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "The only way forward," he began, and then stopped. His eyes flickered. His jaw tightened. He was trying to remember the exact wording he had used before. The wording that had been written for him, rehearsed for him, drilled into him until it sounded natural. But under pressure, the script was slipping. "The only way forward is together," he said slowly. "The old ways are dying. We must unite." He was hesitating, stumbling. The smooth performance was cracking. and everyone in the room could see it. "That's interesting," Ilara said. "When people remember something real, they don't have to think about the wording. The memory comes first, and the words follow. But when people are reciting something they've memorized, they have to reconstruct the script. They have to remember how it was phrased, and under pressure, they make mistakes." "This is ridiculous," Vincent snapped, his composure finally breaking. "Who is this woman? Why is she even here? Domenico, are you going to let some fat therapist interrogate me at your brother's memorial?" Domenico didn't answer. He was staring at Vincent with those pale gray eyes, and something was shifting in his expression. Something cold and dangerous. "Sophia," Ilara said quietly. "Now." Sophia pressed a button on her phone, and Vincent Abruzzo's voice filled the room. Not the warm, polished voice from the eulogy, but a cold, sharp voice, full of menace. "You think you can just say no to me, Enzo? You think you can stand in the way of progress? Let me make something very clear to you. The merger is happening, with or without your approval. And if you keep fighting me on this, well, accidents happen. To people, to families, to beloved brothers who think they're untouchable." The recording played on. There was more. Threats, demands, ultimatums. And then Enzo's voice, calm and steady. "I will never agree to this, Vincent. My brother will never agree to this. You can threaten me all you want. I'm not afraid of you. You should be." Vincent's voice hissed. "You really should be." The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute. Vincent Abruzzo's face had gone white. His hands were shaking. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "That's a lie," he said. "That's a fabrication. She made that recording. She's trying to frame me." "The recording is time-stamped," Sophia said, her voice trembling but strong. 3 days before my father died, and I have the original files, and the letters, and the contracts. It's all here." She held up a folder, thick with papers. Domenico moved. It was the first time Ilara had seen him move with purpose since she'd arrived. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, took the folder from Sophia's hands, and began to read. His face, already gray, went grayer. His jaw, already tight, went tighter. His hands, already shaking, began to tremble violently. When he looked up, his eyes were no longer hollow. They were full of fire. "Vincent," he said, and his voice was very, very quiet. "You killed my brother." "I didn't. You killed my brother because he wouldn't agree to your merger. You threatened him. You threatened his family. And when he still said no, you had him shot outside a restaurant like a dog." "Domenico, please, you have to understand." "I don't have to understand anything," Domenico said. "I have to make sure you never hurt anyone in my family again." What happened next was swift and brutal. Domenico's men, who had been stationed around the room, silent and watchful, closed in on Vincent Abruzzo like wolves. He tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. He tried to fight, but there were too many of them. Within seconds, he was on his knees, his hands bound behind his back, his face pressed against the marble floor. "Take him downstairs," Domenico said. "I'll deal with him later." Vincent was dragged away, screaming. The guests stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and fear and, in some cases, grim satisfaction. The alliance that Vincent had been trying to force was dead. The merger was dead. The threat to the Marchetti family was dead. And Enzo Marchetti, at last, could rest. In the chaos that followed, the guests fleeing, the men securing the estate, the family gathering in a tight, protective cluster around Sophia, Ilara slipped away. She found a quiet corner of the garden, away from the lights and the noise, and sat down on a stone bench beneath a flowering dogwood tree. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing. The stars were beginning to emerge, faint and distant, through the breaking clouds. She sat there for a long time, breathing in the cold night air, letting the tension drain from her body. She had done what she came to do, not what she had been hired to do, not grief counseling, not family therapy, but what she had needed to do. She had listened, she had heard the lie, and she had helped a grieving daughter find justice for her father. She heard footsteps on the gravel path and looked up. Domenico Marchetti was walking toward her, his silhouette sharp against the lights of the house. He stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. "You're still here," he said. "I was just leaving," Ilara said, starting to stand. "Don't." She paused, halfway up, and then settled back onto the bench. Domenico stood there for another moment, and then, to her surprise, he sat down beside her. Not close, but not far. A respectful distance. The distance of a man who was not used to being close to anyone. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "I do. I dismissed you. My family dismissed you. We treated you like you were nothing. And you just saved my niece. You exposed my brother's killer. You did what I should have done." "You were grieving," Ilara said. "Grief makes it hard to see clearly. That's not an excuse." "No, it's not, but it's an explanation." Domenico was silent for a moment. Then he said, "How did you know? About the phrase, about the lie?" "I've spent my whole career listening to people talk about the dead," Ilara said. "Most people don't realize how much they reveal when they speak, the words they choose, the rhythms they use, the places where their voices catch or don't catch. Grief is supposed to be messy. When it's too clean, too polished, too perfect, that's when I know something is wrong. And you heard that in Vincent's eulogy. I heard it immediately. The phrase was too rehearsed, too symmetrical. Real memories don't sound like that." Domenico nodded slowly. "You said something when we first met. You said most people perform grief. They use it as a weapon, or a shield, or a currency. I didn't understand what you meant then. I understand now." "Vincent was using grief as a weapon," Ilara said. "He was using your brother's death to push you into an alliance that your brother had opposed. He was counting on your grief to make you vulnerable, to make you agree to something you would never have agreed to if you were thinking clearly." "And I almost did," Domenico said, his voice rough. "I was so lost, so broken. I would have signed anything if it meant I didn't have to feel this pain anymore. But you didn't. Because of you. Because of Sophia," Ilara corrected gently. "She's the one who kept the evidence. She's the one who trusted me. She's the one who was brave enough to speak up." "She trusted you," Domenico said. "She doesn't trust anyone, not even me. But she trusted you. She needed someone who would listen." Domenico turned to look at her then, really look at her, and Ilara felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. His pale gray eyes were still red-rimmed, still hollow with grief, but there was something else in them now, something that looked almost like wonder. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I know," Ilara said. "I never am." "That's not an insult. I know that too." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge. The house behind them was quieting down. The guests were gone. The men were securing the perimeter. Somewhere inside, Sophia was probably crying. Real tears, finally. The tears she hadn't been able to shed while she was holding everything together. "What happens now?" Ilara asked. "Now I deal with Vincent," Domenico said. "And then I rebuild. My brother spent his whole life trying to keep this family independent. I'm not going to let his death be the thing that destroys what he built. And Sophia? Sophia will be protected. She'll have whatever she needs. She's the only family I have left." "She needs more than protection," Ilara said. "She needs someone to listen to her, someone who isn't part of this world, someone who can help her process what she's been through." Domenico was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Would you stay?" Ilara blinked. "What?" "Not forever, not even for long, but for a while. To help Sofia, to help me." The last words seemed to cost him something. His jaw tightened, and he looked away, staring out at the dark garden. "I don't know how to do this. Grieve, I mean. I don't know how to do it without turning it into rage, without turning it into violence. My brother was the only person who ever made me feel like I could be something other than what I am, and now he's gone." Ilara felt her heart twist. She had seen this before too. The moment when the mask slipped, when the armor cracked, when the person underneath finally admitted that they were drowning. "I can stay for a little while," she said, "but I'm not a miracle worker. I can't fix what's broken. I can only help you learn to carry it." "That's enough," Domenico said. "That's more than I've had in a long time." He stood up, and after a moment, Ilara stood too. They walked back toward the house together, not touching, not speaking, but somehow closer than they had been before. The lights of the estate glowed warm and golden against the night, and somewhere inside, a girl was waiting for someone to tell her that everything was going to be okay. Ilara didn't know if everything was going to be okay. She didn't know if Domenico Marchetti would ever be able to grieve honestly, or if Sofia would ever be able to heal from the trauma of losing her father, or if the Marchetti family would ever be free from the cycle of violence that had defined them for generations. But she knew one thing for certain. She had been dismissed, mocked, and underestimated, and she had still done what she came to do. She had listened, she had heard the lie, and she had helped a grieving family find the truth. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The days that followed were strange and quiet. Ilara stayed at the Marchetti estate, sleeping in a guest room that was larger than her entire apartment in New York, eating meals prepared by a chef who had worked for the family for 30 years, and spending hours each day with Sofia. The girl was a tangle of emotions, fury and grief and relief and guilt, all knotted together so tightly that Ilara sometimes felt like she was trying to untie a Gordian knot with her bare hands. But slowly, painfully, Sofia began to talk about her father, about her fears, about the night she had heard the news and felt her whole world collapse. "I knew something was wrong," Sofia said one afternoon, sitting on the window seat in her bedroom, her knees drawn up to her chest. "The night he died, I knew. I felt it, like a cold hand on my heart." "That's not unusual," Ilara said gently. "People who are close often sense when something has happened to someone they love. It's not supernatural. It's just connection. I should have done something. What could you have done?" "I don't know. Warned him. Told him not to go out that night. Something." "Your father knew the risks of his life," Ilara said. "He made his choices. And from everything you've told me, he made those choices to protect you, to protect your uncle, to protect this family. He wouldn't want you to carry guilt for something that wasn't your fault." Sofia was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you think he knew, at the end, that Vincent was behind it?" "I don't know," Ilara said honestly, "but I think he knew that you loved him, and I think that's what mattered to him most." Sofia's eyes filled with tears, real tears, the kind that came from a place deeper than performance. She didn't try to wipe them away, she just let them fall. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me, for listening, for not treating me like a child." "You're not a child," Ilara said. "You're a young woman who has been through something terrible, and you're handling it with more courage than most adults I know." Sofia smiled. A small, fragile smile, but a real one. The first real smile Ilara had seen on her face. Meanwhile, Domenico was dealing with Vincent Abruzzo. Ilara didn't ask for details. She didn't want to know. But she heard things. Whispers in the hallways, fragments of conversation, the distant sound of doors closing, and cars arriving and departing at odd hours. The alliance was dead. The merger was dead. Vincent Abruzzo's shipping empire was being dismantled, piece by piece, absorbed into the Marchetti organization, or sold off to competitors. And Vincent himself, well, no one spoke about Vincent anymore. He had simply ceased to be relevant. One evening, about a week after the memorial dinner, Domenico found Ilara in the library. She was sitting in one of the leather armchairs, reading a book she had found on the shelves, an old volume of poetry, inscribed on the flyleaf in Enzo's handwriting. To my brother, who never learned to read poetry but always understood it anyway. That was Enzo's favorite, Domenico said, standing in the doorway. He used to read it to Sofia when she was little. She couldn't understand the words, but she loved the sound of his voice. Ilara looked up. Domenico looked different than he had a week ago. Still tired, still grieving, but the hollow, haunted look in his eyes had softened. He was sleeping, maybe, eating, maybe, beginning the long, slow process of learning to live without his brother. "How are you doing?" Ilara asked. "I don't know," Domenico said. He crossed the room and sat down in the armchair across from her. "Some days, I feel like I'm drowning. Other days, I feel nothing at all. I don't know which is worse." "Both are normal," Ilara said. "Grief isn't a straight line. It's a spiral. You keep coming back to the same feelings, but each time, they're a little less sharp, a little more bearable." "You really believe that?" "I've seen it, hundreds of times. It's the only thing I know for certain about grief. It changes. It doesn't go away, but it changes." Domenico nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth. Then he said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about how most people perform grief, how they use it as a weapon, or a shield, or a currency. Yes? I think I've been doing that my whole life, not just with grief, with everything. Performing, being the person everyone expects me to be, the cold boss, the ruthless leader, the man who doesn't feel anything." "And who is the person you actually are?" Domenico let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I don't know. I've been performing for so long that I'm not sure there's anyone left underneath." "There is," Ilara said. "I've seen glimpses of him. The man who loves his niece. The man who mourns his brother. The man who sat in the garden with me and admitted he didn't know how to grieve. That man is real. He's just been buried under a lot of armor." Domenico looked at her then, and his pale gray eyes were full of something that Ilara couldn't quite name. Vulnerability, maybe. Or hope. Or something even more dangerous. "You see things that other people don't," he said. "It's my job. It's more than that. It's who you are." Ilara felt heat rise to her cheeks. She looked away, down at the book in her lap. "I've had a lot of practice. When you're fat in a world that hates fat people, you learn to pay attention. You learn to see the things that other people miss. Because if you don't, you won't survive." "Is that what it's been like for you?" Domenico asked quietly. "Survival?" "Sometimes," Ilara said. "Not always. I've built a good life for myself. A career I'm proud of. Work that matters. But yes, there have been times when it felt like survival. When people looked at me and saw only my body, not my mind. When they dismissed me before I even opened my mouth. When they treated me like I was less than human because I took up more space than they thought I should." "I'm sorry," Domenico said. "For what?" "For being one of those people. When you first arrived, I dismissed you too. I looked at you and I thought you were soft. I thought you were weak. I thought you couldn't possibly understand this world. And now I think you're one of the strongest people I've ever met. And I think softness isn't weakness. I think it's a different kind of strength. A kind I've never learned. Ilara didn't know what to say to that. She sat there, holding the book of poetry, feeling the weight of Domenico's words settle over her like a blanket. No one had ever called her strong before. No one had ever looked at her soft, fat body and seen strength. They saw laziness. They saw lack of discipline. They saw a woman who had let herself go. They never saw the years of work, the years of study, the years of building a career and a life and a sense of self-worth in a world that told her every single day that she was not enough. "Thank you," she said finally. "It's not a compliment," Domenico said. "It's the truth." They sat together in the library for a long time after that, not talking, just existing in the same space. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the dogwood tree, and somewhere in the house, Sofia was playing music, something soft and sad, a piano piece that Enzo had loved. And Ilara thought, this is what healing looks like. Not a dramatic breakthrough, not a single moment of catharsis. Just this, quiet moments, honest words, the slow, painful process of learning to be human again. She stayed for another 2 weeks. She met with Sofia every day, helping her process her grief, helping her find ways to honor her father's memory, without being consumed by it. She met with Domenico less often, but when she did, their conversations were long and meandering, and surprisingly intimate. He told her about his childhood, about growing up in the shadow of his father's violence, about the day he had first held a gun, about the moment he had realized that he would never be free of this life. She told him about her own childhood, about the first time she had been called fat, about the years of diets and shame and self-hatred, about the day she had decided to stop apologizing for her body and start living in it. "How did you do it?" Domenico asked. "Stop apologizing, I mean." "I realized that the people who wanted me to apologize were never going to accept me anyway," Ilara said. "No matter how much weight I lost, no matter how much I tried to shrink myself, it would never be enough for them. So I decided to stop trying, to take up space, to be visible, to demand to be seen. That's brave. It's survival. Like I said, maybe survival is the bravest thing there is." On her last night at the estate, Sofia threw her arms around Ilara and held on tight. "I don't want you to go," she whispered. "I know," Ilara said, hugging her back. "But you don't need me anymore. You're strong enough to carry this on your own now, and if you ever need me again, you have my number. Promise you'll answer." "I promise." Domenico walked her to the car. The driver was waiting, the engine running, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The night was cold and clear, the stars bright overhead. "I have something for you," Domenico said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "It's not a gift. It's a thank you for everything you've done for my family." Ilara opened the box. Inside was a pendant, a small silver key, delicate and simple, on a thin silver chain. "It was my mother's," Domenico said. "She gave it to me when I was a boy. She said it was the key to her heart. I've never given it to anyone, but I want you to have it. Domenico, I can't. You can. You saved my family. You saved my niece. You saved me, in ways I'm still trying to understand. This is the least I can do." Ilara looked at the pendant, then at Domenico. His face was open in a way she had never seen before. Unguarded, vulnerable, almost hopeful. "Thank you," she said. "I'll treasure it." She put the necklace on. the silver key resting against her chest, cool and light. Domenico reached out and touched it gently, his fingers brushing against her collarbone. "Softness cuts deeper than suspicion," he said. "That's what you taught me. I won't forget it." And then he stepped back, and Elara got into the car, and the driver pulled away down the long gravel driveway, past the gates, out into the world beyond. She didn't look back, but she held the key in her hand the whole way home, and she thought about a grieving Mafia boss who had learned that strength came in many forms, and a teenage girl who had found the courage to speak the truth, and a dead man whose final wishes had finally been honored. She had been hired to counsel grief. She had ended up uncovering murder. And somewhere along the way, she had reminded a family full of dangerous, broken people that the softest things in the world, love, trust, honesty, were also the sharpest. That was enough. That was more than enough. And as the lights of Boston rose up to meet her, Elara Vance smiled and touched the key at her throat and began to think about what came next.